The only option for surviving, if any, was to get out of the aircraft. And I pulled the ejection handle. I was at 51 degrees nose low, so a very steep dive, just over 2,000 feet above the ocean. And in miles per hour, that was 695 miles per hour. Ripped my helmet off my head, smashed my face up, smashed my skull, giving me a severe traumatic brain injury. I broke my C1 in my neck. I broke my left scapula and my shoulder, bilateral humerus fractures, so both my upper arms. My humerus in my right arm tore through my right brachial artery, causing internal bleeding. My left forearm shattered the radius and ulna and severed the median nerve, which controlled my left hand. Again, I ejected so fast that it shredded open my dry suit. My legs flailed around so violently in that airflow of impacting the sound barrier with my body that my steel-toed boots smashed open my lower legs, causing open fractures of both my tibia and fibula in both my lower legs. So I was just a mess. You're never going to walk again. You're never going to use your arms again. And your flying career is absolutely over. I thought I was being hunted by the government. I thought there were assassins out the windows. I thought they were poisoning my family's food and water. So I stopped eating and drinking. So I planned an escape. Late one night, I pulled the fire alarm. Those of us that wanted to could make a run for it. Forced to take a medication called Heldol, an injection. And that felt like insects crawling their way out from underneath my skin. My wife came home to find me completely naked. I had a black plastic garbage bag tied around my shoulders like a cape. And I had shaved off my hair in chunks. I had shaved off my eyebrows for some reason. And I was about to go out into the snowy Michigan weather and fight crime like a superhero.
Welcome to Sunny Side Up Podcast. I am your host, David, and I am very pleased to meet you, Kegan.
Likewise, David. Thank you for having me on.
So, first question I got for you is, when did you join the Navy?
So I joined the Navy in 2009. I first went to Navy OCS in Newport, Rhode Island.
Okay. So, and I know that you're a pilot, and we'll get into that, but did you join the Navy first and then become a pilot, or did you just start training for that from the day one?
So I was a flight instructor in college. As I finished my 4-year degree, I worked as a flight instructor, and then I spent about a year after college working as a corporate pilot, flying for a small business. And I had a friend who was applying to go into the Navy to be a pilot, and he was talking about it. I was like, well, don't you have to go to the Naval Academy? And doesn't your dad have to be an admiral? Like, you can't just get a pilot slot in the Navy, can you? And he kind of talked to me about the application process, and come to find out, I already had a bachelor's degree and I already had flight experience. So it made for a pretty competitive package when I applied. So when I applied to go into the Navy, I applied specifically just to go in for a pilot slot. And I was picked up. And after 13 weeks at Navy OCS, which is just basically boot camp, I went into the training pipeline for becoming a naval aviator. And I didn't know what I was going to fly. I didn't know if I'd be in helos or patrol planes or jets, but I knew I was going to fly something if I could make it through the training. And I did pretty well in flight training, and I excelled and worked really hard. And after 2 years, I had earned my wings as a naval aviator. From my winging, I had selected the Super Hornet, the F-18 Super Hornet, to fly. I was really excited showing up in these hangars with these massive aircraft. I mean, they looked way bigger than I ever could have imagined once you're up close. And spent another year doing flight training in the Super Hornet to become qualified. And then I was assigned my first fleet squadron, VFA 143, the Pukin Dogs, out of Virginia Beach, Virginia, NAS Oceana. And I had been in my squadron for approximately 8 months. And so I wasn't the new guy anymore, but I still had a lot to learn. There's just this constant fire hose of knowledge that you're constantly drinking from in order to learn everything you need to do, and to be able to do everything you need to do in the Super Hornet. There's just so many diverse tactics. It's the fighter jet that we jokingly say is like the jack of all trades, master of none, because we have to be reasonably decent at doing a very wide range of skill set, where a lot of fighter squadrons, you'll have just a very specific focus. You'll either be the air to air guru, or the electronic attack gurus, or the air to ground gurus, as far as like the Air Force operates for the most part. But for the Navy, we have one fighter airframe, strike fighter airframe, and so we have to be able to do a huge variety of things. Anyways, I'd come a long ways. I was starting to feel like I was getting the ropes. And on January 15th, 2014, I had an event that drastically changed the trajectory of my life. Flying around in fighter jets had kind of become a little bit of a routine. It had just kind of become my norm. And I didn't think about how dangerous it was anymore. But on this day in January, I walked into the squadron. My buddy Fisty's at the squadron duty desk, and he's a guy who loved to joke with everybody. And he had put up on the whiteboard behind him the airspace that we were going to be utilizing that day out over the Atlantic Ocean. And on that airspace, he had marked all the GPS tagged sharks that were underneath that airspace out in the Atlantic Ocean. And he had joked that day, like, hey, well, one, the water temperature that day was at 37 degrees Fahrenheit. We had had a really cold winter, below freezing air temps. The sea was pretty churned up. So those conditions were hazardous. But then he joked, there's this 16-foot, 3,500-pound great white shark directly underneath the airspace you're about to go fly in. He's like, it'd just be a bad day to eject. And we laughed about that. And also, as I'm getting ready to go on this flight, another one of the more senior pilots in the squadron, Basil, came up to me and he said, you just haven't done anything dumb enough yet to earn a call sign. And there were guys that were newer in the squadron than me, and they all had call signs already. But I had just been the small mouth, big ears guy, and I hadn't really stuck out in any way that had earned me a call sign, which is typically based on something really embarrassing or stupid you do. So I was kind of proud that I hadn't done anything to stick out yet. So I walk on this flight, take off. The vast majority of the flight goes as planned. No big issues or anything. And I get towards the end of the flight, and we were practicing what's called basic fighter maneuvering, BFM, which is probably what people think of as the epitome of what a fighter pilot is, which is a couple aircraft trying to shoot each other down within visual range. So if you've seen the new Top Gun Maverick movie, there's a lot of that dogfighting going on. It's very dynamic, high paced. You're operating weapon systems. You're maneuvering a jet under high G. It's physically demanding, mentally demanding, and it's one of my favorite skill sets, and I absolutely loved it. We got to the last set of the day. We had just enough fuel to knock out one short fight with each other. So my flight lead set up off my left wing. I was on his right, and he called 3, 2, 1, fights on, and we pitched in at each other like a couple medieval knights in a jousting match, essentially, at one another. And as we crossed paths, I was focused on utilizing the helmet that I had just become qualified with. It's called the Jehemix helmet, which is a joint helmet mounted cueing system. And what that does is it allows you to, wherever you look, your weapon systems and all this sort of aircraft information comes with you. So you can turn your head and see all these displays right in the visor. It's a really cool piece of kit, but just like any complex piece of equipment, it takes some time for it to become intuitive. And I wasn't quite at the point where I was intuitive with it. I knew how to operate it, but it was still a little bit of a distraction. And in that second, I didn't quite realize the airspeed I had gotten up to, which was significantly faster than what you would want for maneuvering the jet in a dive. But I was already partially nose low and partially inverted at that merge. So I continued my pull in what's called a split S maneuver, which is essentially just a big dive down at the ocean. So I maneuvered the jet in this dive. The other aircraft went up. So I'm straining. I'm under high G. I'm pulling about 7.5 Gs, and I can feel that throughout my body. if say it sitting here at 1G on the ground, my head and my helmet that I had on weighed about 20 pounds. If you're under almost 8Gs, that's now like having 160 pounds on your head. So it's like having a full size adult you're holding up with your neck. Not to mention my body now weighs over 1,000 pounds. So I can feel all that in the G. I'm straining, I'm looking, I'm trying to get a radar lock of the other aircraft in this fight. And as I hit bullseye nose low or thereabouts, the aircraft had accelerated to a point that it hit what was called the G bucket. And what this is put in place to do is to protect the aircraft from overstressing the wings. In this case, the aircraft thought there were bombs on the wings that weren't actually there. And when it thought that, it limited the amount of G available. And I didn't realize this was going on at the time. All I felt was I went from that 7.5G pull down to about 4 or 5Gs, and I could just feel it ease up. And I knew something was wrong. This is like going around a sharp corner in a sports car and then feeling the steering wheel kick back halfway. Only instead of skidding off the road, now I'm stuck in a dive at the ocean. I did everything I could. I pulled the throttle to idle. I put up the speed brake in the limited time I had with my understanding what was going on, but it was too little too late. The ocean was just rushing up at me, and I knew that the only option for surviving, if any, was to get out of the aircraft. I reached down between my legs and I pulled the ejection handle. A normal ejection is pretty violent. It'll cause compression to the spine. Guys often get flail injuries, and this is ejections below 200 knots, straight and level. When I pulled the ejection handle, I was at 51 degrees nose low, so a very steep dive. I was at just over 2,000 feet above the ocean, so within 2 seconds of impacting the ocean in that jet. And I was traveling at 0.95 indicated Mach, so 95% the speed of sound at sea level. So really fast. And in miles per hour, that was 695 miles per hour. Now, if you've ever stuck your arm or your face out a car window going 70 miles down the highway, you felt about 1/100th of the force that acted on my body. So as I came out into the airflow, I was just like a rag doll in a hurricane. It ripped my helmet off my head, smashed my face up, smashed my skull, giving me a severe traumatic brain injury. I broke my C1 in my neck. I broke my left scapula and my shoulder, bilateral humerus fractures, so both my upper arms. My humerus in my right arm tore through my right brachial artery, causing internal bleeding. My left forearm shattered the radius and ulna and severed the median nerve, which controlled my left hand. I was ejected so fast that the gear on my vest shredded off the vest. I was wearing a dry suit to protect me from that frigid ocean water if this were to happen. But again, I ejected so fast that it shredded open my dry suit. My legs flailed around so violently in that airflow of impacting the sound barrier with my body that my steel-toed boots smashed open my lower legs, causing open fractures of both my tibia and fibula in both my lower legs. So I was just a mess. Fortunately, my parachute opened just enough time to save me from dying on impact with the water. And I plunged into that 37-degree Fahrenheit ocean water, which is, feels like needles on your skin at that temperature. And if you're into cold plunging, um, spending just a few minutes in that kind of water is challenging. And I was about to spend the next hour and a half in it with a tattered dry suit and destroyed body. The parachute that had just saved my life sunk under the ocean current and started to drag me under. Due to another gear malfunction, it didn't properly disconnect, and I had no ability to manually disconnect the parachute with my destroyed arms. And so that parachute started to drag me under the water. And if you've ever been held underwater when you need a breath of air, you know how terrible that feeling is. I was in and out of consciousness. I don't know how I didn't drown alive, but somehow I managed to bob up to the surface often enough that I could cough up water and get a quick breath of air before being drug under. Meanwhile, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, at any moment, Mary Lee can come up and finish me off. That big 16-foot, 3,500-pound great white shark that I knew was right in my area. And, after all the movies and everything, you think a drop of blood in the water, they can smell for a mile. So I'm just bleeding out. So I was like, oh, man, I'm basically chumming the water for her. Um, Fortunately, my flight lead saw my position. He coordinated a miraculous rescue effort. After about an hour and a half, I got picked up by a Navy H-60 Seahawk helicopter, and I was rushed back to Norfolk General, which is a level 1 trauma center in Norfolk, Virginia. On the flight, I was in and out of consciousness. I had coded several times. They were doing everything they could to resuscitate me and keep me alive. Um, as a bit of humorous relief during all of this, one of the helicopter crew members had started to eat his lunch when they got the search and rescue call for me, and he had to just kind of shove it in the bag and throw it in the corner of the cabin of the helicopter. And in all the chaos of me being rescued, his meatball sub somehow broke loose, and so I ended up getting coated in marinara and meatball. So as the rescue crew of the helicopters wheeling me into the hospital, they're like explaining to the medical staff, they're like, hey, he's in bad shape, but all that gore on him, that's just my lunch. uh, they rushed me into the hospital. They treated me for severe hypothermia. My core body temperature was at 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So I should have been dead from hypothermia, but that severe hypothermia had actually kept me alive, kept me from bleeding to death. Had I not had my dry suit tattered and exposed to that cold ocean water, I would have bled to death way before anybody got there. Um, they stabilized me halfway decently. Blood transfusions, hypothermia treatment. I mean, they were doing everything they could to keep me alive. Once I was semi-stable, they induced a coma, and I spent the next week undergoing over a dozen trauma surgeries. I had fasciotomies performed to salvage all 4 of my extremities to prevent uh, from being amputated. I was lucky not to be a quadriplegic at this point. They did a brachial artery bypass, and they reassembled the vast majority of my skeleton with titanium rods, steel plates, and screws. So now my X-ray looks like Wolverine, legitimately. Uh, After another week in that coma, they didn't know if I was going to come to. They didn't know if I was just going to be brain dead. And all my squadron mates, my family, and friends are in the waiting room at the ICU, just waiting to hear, am I going to be a vegetable? What's going to become of my fate? And Basil, the same guy who just before the flight said I hadn't done anything worthy of a call sign yet, kind of piped up and said, he's a scrappy mother. He'll be fine. And so that kind of lifted the spirits of the room, and they took that and shortened it down to a makeshift acronym, SMURF. And because it's the military, you have to have a politically correct cover story. So mine is I'm a short guy that turned blue from hypothermia, but the real reason is for scrappy mother. And so at this point, I had been in a coma for 2 weeks, and the first thing as I came to, I had no idea where I was. I didn't have any recollection of the ejection. I had a pretty bad brain injury. So between the head injury and the drugs they had me on, all the painkillers, um, I was a mess. But one of the first thoughts I had was I thought I had been tied down onto the gurney I was on the bed, but it was because I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. The medical staff eventually came in and told me, "Hey, here's what's happened. You've been in a severe injury. You're never going to walk again. You're never going to use your arms again, and your flying career is absolutely over." And in the back of my mind was, I'm going to prove you wrong. And that kind of became my driving force initially. And every day I just tried to do whatever I could, wiggle anything I could. And little by little, um, I started to get some function back. I spent the next 3 months in the Poly Trauma Center down in Richmond, Virginia's VA hospital, doing every kind of therapy known to man all day, every day, from occupational therapy, speech therapy, vision therapy, kinesiotherapy, aquatherapy, recreational therapy. I was just getting all these different reps and trying to wiggle my fingers and this and that. And after 3 months of that, I was able to regain the use of my legs and my arms good enough that I could scoot around on a walker. I was released. I spent the next year and a half doing a lot of therapy as an outpatient. The world was kind of crushing down on me. I still had this destroyed body. My career was in jeopardy for having been involved in a mishap. Um, I was on all sorts of pain medications, from amitriptyline, tramadol, trazodone, oxycodone, OxyContin, fentanyl, Dilaudid, in massive doses of gabapentin, not to mention all the medications they were giving me to counter-effect all the side effects. Um, and I was a mess. And I thought my life was over. Um, Fortunately, the investigation uh, kind of ruled in my favor. While I was partially at fault for what had happened, that same system that had overrode my control inputs had caused mishaps previous to me and much more senior pilots. And I know at least one guy after my ejection that he was a Top Gun instructor at the prime of his career was killed by that same system. Um, Anyways, I had a second chance if I could get my body back to potentially go back and fly. I battled with the flight surgeons to get a stack of medical waivers. And after 2 years of intense rehabilitation and PTing my butt off, I was literally running circles around almost everybody in my command. And they saw like I had made this miraculous recovery. And so I got to go back and fly Super Hornets. And I was back flying for about a year and a half. And it seemed like, this is where the Disney version of my story would end, like this happy ending. However, things took a turn for an even more wild adventure than the one I just told you. Um, I was on a flight, and it was suspected that there was some sort of cabin pressure malfunction. And what that can do to you is cause decompression sickness. And anybody who's a scuba diver is probably familiar with this. If you come up from depth too quickly, it's kind of like opening a bottle of soda quickly and how it fizzes as it depressurizes. The same thing can kind of happen to your blood if you have a rapid decompression. And so if you get one of those little bubbles in your brain, it can cause all sorts of mental dysfunction, aneurysm, even death. And from the best we can figure, I got one of these bubbles in my brain that potentially triggered an already unresolved brain injury from my ejection. And it sent me for a loop. I stopped being able to sleep. I started having panic attacks, and my life started to just kind of spin out of control. Um, I knew I couldn't fly anymore. I ended up going into medical to try to get some help. And the traumatic brain injury component of all of this was largely overlooked. And the path that I went on was one of a delayed onset PTSD diagnosis for post traumatic stress disorder. Um, and the treatment for that at the time was more meds. And after weaning myself off of all those pain meds and the withdrawals I went through, the last thing I wanted was more pharmaceuticals in my body, but it was presented really as the only viable option for treating my PTSD. Um, and unfortunately, that led to antipsychotic medications to try to help me sleep. And as time went on, I got worse and worse. The same cycle that had happened with the pain meds. Your body adapts, and then you need more of it, and more of it, and more of it. And it took just a few months on that medication. Hold on, buddy. I'm doing a podcast right now. This is my son.
Hello.
um, and anyways, I went from having this sort of hypervigilance and paranoia and these panic attacks and insomnia. And as I had that dosage of medication increased, I started to have full blown psychoses. Um, it was like being in the Truman Show. I thought everybody in the world was watching me. I thought, at one point I thought I was being hunted by the government. I thought there were assassins out the windows. I thought they were poisoning my family's food and water. So I stopped eating and drinking. Um, I was eventually medically retired from the military dealing with this, uh, which was a brutal process in itself. Uh, I was suicidal. I nearly took my own life one night, and luckily my son and my wife were sleeping next to me, and I looked over and realized I couldn't do that to them. So my life had just crumbled apart. We moved back to northern Michigan and continued that treatment through the VA with the medication I was taking called Seroquel or quetiapine. And within a few nights of increasing my dose from 300 milligrams a night to 450 milligrams, which is a serious heroic dose of that medication, um, my wife came home to find me completely naked. I had a black plastic garbage bag tied around my shoulders like a cape, and I had shaved off my hair in chunks. I had shaved off my eyebrows for some reason, and I was about to go out into the snowy Michigan weather and fight crime like a superhero. So my wife rushed me to the emergency room. I had a full out of body experience in the emergency room. I like my, and for my understanding of it, I'm just trying to explain it the best I can. Is I just had this, basically my awareness and my soul just departed my body and traveled through space and time and just went off into nowhere, and my body was left there just on the floor, incapacitated. After a couple nights in the ER, I was transferred down to Battle Creek, Michigan, to the VA inpatient psych facility there. I came to on the floor after a few days, just in a stupor. I was completely out of it, but little by little, I started to regain lucid moments, and what I saw in there, the stuff that, not the stuff I hallucinated, but the real things that were going on, were incredibly frustrating. First, you're confined in the small facility. It's very difficult to sleep because there are other veterans struggling with severe mental health ailments wandering the halls and moaning all night. The staff members are walking up and down these hard tile floors and concrete walled hallways, and it echoes everywhere. Every step, the jangling of their keys, you can hear everything. So it's very loud. It's very disturbing just to be in there. So sleep is difficult on that note. And then if you're in a one-to-one care situation like I was, their policy was, for my safety, they had to shine a flashlight in my face every 15 minutes to check and make sure I was safe. So this caused a serious case of sleep deprivation. Um, so you're confined, sleep deprived, and the nutrition that you're getting in this facility is effectively um, prison food. It's just nutrient void, highly processed garbage. And the water that you get out of the tap tastes like it came out of a broken hot tub. Hey, buddy, why don't you go down with mommy? Okay. Love you, buddy. And so all these things kind of compound on themselves. And in survival training in the military, you can take a highly functional, capable uh, military member in perfectly good health. And if you put them in a situation where they're confined, sleep deprived, and malnourished, within a few days, they're going to start having visual and auditory hallucinations. Now, at the hospital that's supposed to be treating you to help you from that situation is effectively doing the exact same things. They're sleep depriving you, they're not nourishing you, they're confining you, and you're getting treated like less than a human in many ways because you're in this cognitive impaired state where people kind of don't treat you like a person anymore. And it was just heartbreaking to me to see that's the treatment for guys coming from the lowest moments in their life, oftentimes from service related injury. And so I planned an escape. I was going to get out of there. Late one night, I pulled the fire alarm, thinking that they would let us out so we could, escape the fire. And in that, those of us that wanted to could make a run for it. Well, apparently somebody had already tried that. They just shut the alarm down. Base police showed up, and I was forced to take a medication called Heldol, an injection, and that felt like insects crawling their way out from underneath my skin. All I wanted to do was rip my own skin off and run and scream up and down the hallways. It was absolute torture. Um, I came to the next day just in a drug induced stupor. I was literally drooling on myself when they called me into this room with this woman who was supposed to be my legal representative. I could barely say my name, and they had me signing legal documents that I didn't even know I was signing legal documents at the time. But what those documents did is they committed me to the facility. I was voluntarily admitted, meaning I could have left, although they wouldn't let me leave. Supposedly, I should have been able to leave when I wanted, but now I had been committed. I was no longer legally allowed to leave the facility. It also put me on the law enforcement information network that the police use in case I'm ever pulled over. I'll pop up as if I were a criminal. And it also stripped away my Second Amendment right to bear arms. I'm no longer allowed to purchase firearms. Um, Here I was, an American veteran, just trying to get help. And instead, I was confined, malnourished, tortured, and had my constitutional rights stripped from me. Fortunately, after about a month, my family advocated to get me out of that facility. There were so many other guys in there that didn't have that, and they were trapped there indefinitely. And while you're there, the only option that you have is you have to take the drugs. And in my mind, it seemed like it was an indoctrination process to get you completely dependent on the pharmaceutical industry until you decide to take your own life. Um, I came out of that facility just feeling betrayed by my government, betrayed by the things I believed in, broken, just experienced so much more trauma on top of my already traumatic experiences I'd been through that landed me there. And I was a broken person. I was depressed. I could barely do the dishes. My mental function was garbage. I couldn't read a sentence without forgetting it. Um, my wife was ready to divorce me. My son, when he tried to come play with me, I would just push him away and tell him to leave me alone. I was just a different person. That spark of joy and hope, and whoever I was gone. And I lived like that for several years. The only thing that kept my marriage together was my wife was afraid I could potentially get some sort of custody, and I was too dangerous to have custody of our children. And that's the only reason she didn't go through with the divorce. Um, and I was hopeless. And I eventually stumbled upon a book called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And while I digested it very slowly, I mean, I could maybe get a paragraph in a day that would actually stick. But eventually I got enough from that book to realize that there may be some hope in psychedelic assisted therapy. And so I reached out to some veteran nonprofit organizations that provide that for veterans, Vet Solutions, and an organization called Warrior Angel Foundation that provides nutraceuticals, so some supplementation to help with brain injury. And they took a completely different approach that didn't involve uh, psychotropic pharmaceutical medications. Initially, I was put on high doses of fish oil. If you can find a high quality fish oil and take it at about, work your way up slowly to about 3,000 milligrams a day, that puts fuel to help rebuild your brain. The fat that's in that can help to heal an injured brain. In all those years, what I really had going on was this underlying brain injury that was just being exacerbated by medications. Um, and I finally started to take a new path. I was fortunate to receive a psychedelic journey that opened my eyes to the insanity that I had been on, this pharmaceutical drug, and the only answer to fix my problem was more of that pharmaceutical drug. And it just, that cycle I'd been in for years. And so I went against the advice of the medical professionals, my family, my wife. Everybody was very apprehensive for me to pursue psychedelic assisted therapy, but something told me this is the only option. I couldn't live the way I was any longer. I was just broken. So I pursued that. And through the help of a number of organizations, I started to receive a different approach. Using the knowledge of Dr. Mark Gordon, there's actually a great podcast on Joe Rogan. I think there's at least two podcasts he's been on there talking about his approach to treating brain injury and PTSD with nutraceuticals and healthy lifestyle, and these ways that you can actually heal the physiology of a damaged brain by good food, nutrition, exercise, high dose fish oil, nutraceutical supplementation. And so I started to take that path uh, with the help of a doctor named Dr. Michael Lewis. And they started to take blood tests and look at my underlying physiology. And it was no longer about like, just how do you feel? And, oh, you have a psychological disorder. And so just take these meds to suppress that. It was now, let's actually heal what's going on underneath. Um, Eventually, I was able to go down to Peru for an ayahuasca experience, a very heavy duty native indigenous medicine that reawakened my soul and healed my broken heart on so many levels. These psychedelics also have massive benefit for the physiological healing of your brain. They help your brain produce a very high level of a protein that we produce when we're toddlers that helps us learn and helps our brain grow rapidly. And they're finding many of these psychedelics actually help your brain produce that at that level that you had when you're a little kid. So it causes this neuroplasticity and it heals the circuitry of your brain very rapidly. And within a few months of these experiences in the nutraceuticals and the approach to healing my physiology, I was becoming a changed person. I had gotten off all psychotropic medications. I was getting very physically fit again. I was feeling better. I was looking better. I was cognitively getting my mind power back, and it just completely turned my life around. And at this point, it's been approximately 3 years since starting that new journey with the use of these alternative modalities. I've been fortunate to go to a traumatic brain injury clinic down in Dallas, Texas called Resiliency Brain Health. I've had a few other indigenous medicine journeys. I've been involved with a meditation program and I've built a solid meditation practice. And at this point, I'm completing ultra endurance events for mountain biking and running. I just wrote a book. I'm podcasting. I'm motivational speaking. I'm a dad again. I'm a husband again. All these things were things I was basically told I had to say goodbye to because of my ailment, because of a PTSD diagnosis, because of psychoses. Um, but I'm here to tell you, if you are dealing with those struggles, you don't have to be trapped in that world anymore. There are other modalities out there, and unfortunately, they're being suppressed by the pharmaceutical industry. They are a competition to their business model, and you can't get these things paid through your insurance company because those two industries work together. The insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry are in cahoots to benefit themselves. Um, but know that there are other options out there, but you'll have to fight to pursue them and find them. But anyways, that's sort of my wild story in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, but I don't want to go on too long with you.
I don't even know what to say. I mean, like I said before we started, I heard some of your story, but I definitely didn't hear that later part. That's I don't even I don't even know what to say. Um, One question that I have, or actually two questions. So, do you know of ATX Hyperbarics in Austin, Texas?
Yeah, I went down there and I did a month of treatment with Clay and Eleanor Womack. Graciously invited me down to their facility, and I met Doc Kirk Parsley down there, who's also a huge advocate for this sort of approach to healing brain injury. But yeah, a month in the hyperbaric treatment, I mean, that was massively beneficial for healing the brain.
So, I just did an episode with Kirk Parsley, great guy,
Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, he's
and
awesome.
also, do you know Sam Womack?
Is that their son?
Yeah.
I think I met him briefly at ATX Hyperbarics.
Okay.
Does he help out at one of the facilities?
Yeah, I did an episode with him also.
Oh,
He
nice.
has his own clinic that he's starting in. I think he said March of this year. I believe. I'm saying if I got that wrong, I'm sorry, but yeah, I know he said he's working through like getting the clinic set up, and he's taking some appointments, kind of I think through friends now, and then he's going to open it up to the kind of to the public later on. But yeah,
Cool.
I just kind of small world, you know.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So the other question I have is, when you first ejected and you were in the ocean, you said for an hour and a half,
Yes.
how did you stay alive to get rescued by the helicopter?
Um, I don't know. It was truly miraculous. I did have a life preserver unit. The small inflatable device had actually deployed. It was one of the few pieces of my survival equipment that functioned properly. And that gave me enough buoyancy that on occasion it would float me up to the surface where I could cough out water and get a breath of air. Um, but I don't know how I didn't drown. I don't know how I didn't bleed out. Um, Eventually, the one of the rescue swimmers jumped out of the helicopter into the water, and he swam down to me and he clipped in to my titanium carabiner on my harness, and he said that parachute drugged both of us underneath the water, even with him being a very fit rescue swimmer, strong swimmer. He said he couldn't fight against it as that parachute drug us under, but he cut me loose with his knife to cut free all that paracord and hooked me up and got me hoisted into the helicopter.
Wow. So, man, that's great. So, how much of that do you remember?
So I don't have a linear memory from about the time I right before I pulled the ejection handle. I remember pretty vividly the ocean rushing up at me and getting that sensation of like, that sinking feeling in your stomach and your heart, just like, oh crap. And I don't remember actually pulling the ejection handle. Um, and from then on, it's sort of I have this non-linear. I get flashbacks of some of it. So for a long time, I was getting night terrors where I'd wake up in the middle of the night just in a panic, and I would have just have experienced like a clip from what I was experiencing under the water. Uh, Hold on a sec, buddy. I'll be done in a few minutes. Okay. I love you. Um, but no, I most of this has been, well, one, the flashbacks, but most of this has been reconstructed. At least while I was in the ocean, that was reconstructed from the information from the data recorder that came out with the ejection seat, the black box, and there was a very in-depth investigation to all of this. I mean, this was an $89 million Super Hornet, and so there's some serious
Hmm.
investigation that goes into losing one.
Right. So, after, so you said that you remember pulling the handle. Is that correct?
Yeah, I remember right up to the point where I pulled the ejection handle.
Okay. So, what is the next memory that you have after that?
Um, Clips of being under the water and bobbing and
Okay.
screaming and just the emotions that were flooding through me at that point. But
Wow.
the
So,
next clear memories that I have were 2 weeks later when I came to out of that coma, and my family was all around me, and I was paralyzed and realized that I couldn't move for the first time. That was my
wow.
first like clear memory.
Hmm. You said it was 2 weeks after?
Yep, 2 weeks after.
That's, I, I can't even begin to imagine that. So, like, when you woke up, what was your first thought that you remember?
Um, my first thought was I thought I had been tied down on that bed, uh, but it was
Oh,
because I
okay.
was, but it's because I was paralyzed, and also I didn't. It felt like I was waking up from a dream. I didn't know where I was.
Hmm.
I recognized people and faces, but um, yeah, my first thought was, why did they tie me to this bed?
Wow. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your, I guess, otherworldly experience. That's the only way I can explain what I just heard. And I think a
Yeah,
lot of people would agree with me. Um, I want to say thank you for your service. I
my pleasure.
tre- tremendously appreciate that, and I can't repay you, but I'm just going to say thank you
That
as
was
much as I can.
It was my pleasure to get that opportunity, and it was for a while there. I got to be a fire breathing dragon, essentially, a knighted mounted on a mechanical fire breathing dragon, and that was
Hmm.
a pretty incredible experience. So I'm very grateful for having that.
Well, I'm grateful for you coming on, and like I said, thank you for sharing that story. I hope that somebody can hear that, and especially when you're talking about the help that you got after and that whole rigmarole, if you want to call it that. I hope that somebody can hear this that's maybe going through something similar and maybe find some peace, or at least know that somebody else is going through it like you did.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I really hope so. And that's why I share about this stuff is I know for a while there I had lost all hope because I didn't know there was anything else out there. And so I really hope this finds people and maybe helps inspire their journey on a different path to recovery and health.
Hmm. Well, I'm sad that we have to cut it short, but I want to say thank you for coming on, and thank you to all my viewers. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for having me on.